In 1936, the United States stood on the edge of a decision that could have altered the course of the Second World War before it even began. Most Americans today remember the years before Pearl Harbor as a period of isolationism, Congress, the public, and even many in the government wanting to stay far from the conflicts brewing in Europe and Asia. But what if I told you that in the middle of that isolationist tide, there was a moment when the U.S. came within a hair's breadth of committing to an international security pact, and that the decision was derailed not by a dramatic debate in the Senate or a high-profile speech, but by a single letter that sat forgotten in a desk drawer? Let's rewind to early 1936. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is in his second term as president. The world is already cracking. Hitler has been in power for 3 years. Mussolini's Italy is invading Ethiopia, and Japan is pushing deeper into China. The League of Nations, conceived after World War I to prevent another global catastrophe, is faltering badly. But inside the State Department, a handful of senior diplomats, most notably Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, are quietly discussing a bold move, joining a mutual defense agreement with key European powers. It's not the League itself. By this point, many in Washington saw the League as too weak. Instead, it was a proposed collective security understanding with Britain, France, and a few smaller allies, aimed at deterring further aggression by threatening a coordinated response. The key was timing. The British government under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was still willing to consider a joint statement with the US, something that would show aggressors that the Atlantic democracies were united. But the window was closing fast. Enter Senator Key Pittman of Nevada, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a man who could make or break any foreign policy initiative in Congress. Hull and his team knew that if Pittman backed the agreement, it would have a chance. If he opposed it, Roosevelt would probably shelve the idea rather than risk a public defeat. In mid-March 1936, after Hitler's stunning move to remilitarize the Rhineland, Hull drafted a carefully worded letter to Pittman. It outlined the proposal, stressed the urgency, and invited the senator to a confidential meeting to discuss how it could be framed in a way that would pass the Senate without igniting isolationist outrage. Hull handed the letter to one of his aides, Joseph Grew, to have it delivered directly to Pittman's office in the Capitol. This is where the butterfly wing flaps. Grew, juggling multiple urgent cables from U.S. embassies in Europe, puts the letter into his outbox with a stack of less urgent correspondence. That stack ends up on the desk of a junior clerk in the State Department's internal mail service, a man named Robert Hinshaw, who had been on the job for less than a month. Hinshaw, seeing that Pittman's office was due to receive another batch of general informational briefings the next day, decided to bundle Hull's personal letter with them. But when the bundle reached the Capitol, the briefings were sorted into the committee's general reading file, and Hull's letter, unmarked as urgent, was placed in Pittman's private in-tray under several reports. Pittman, distracted by a series of hearings on domestic banking reform, didn't even open that in-tray for over 2 weeks. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, events were moving quickly. Baldwin's government in Britain faced intense pressure from both the labor opposition and the right-wing press to avoid any new foreign entanglements. In France, the political situation was so unstable that the foreign ministry was changing hands every few months. Without a prompt signal from Washington, British interest in the joint security statement cooled. By the time Pittman finally read Hull's letter in early April, the moment was gone. Baldwin had quietly told his cabinet that Britain would not pursue the pact, and the French, without British participation, were unwilling to proceed. Pittman sent a polite reply to Hull, expressing his personal interest but suggesting that the political conditions for Senate support are not favorable at present. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. The letter's delay never made headlines, but in diplomatic terms, this was a decisive moment. Without the pact, Hitler faced no unified diplomatic front from the Western democracies in 1936. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, which could have been challenged then and there, stood unopposed. This emboldened the Nazi regime, strengthened Hitler's standing inside Germany, and undermined those in the German military who had privately considered removing him if he pushed too far and met foreign resistance. Historians have long debated whether an Anglo-American statement in March 1936 would have truly deterred Hitler. Some argue he was committed to his path regardless. But there's a strong counterpoint. In 1936, the Wehrmacht was still relatively weak, and Hitler himself admitted later that if France had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. A credible signal of joint action from Britain, France, and the United States, even a diplomatic one, might have forced him to back down. And yet the chance to send that signal disappeared because a piece of paper stayed in the wrong pile on the wrong desk for just long enough. The real irony is that the letter wasn't even dramatic in tone. It didn't threaten war or pledge troops. It was a carefully constructed piece of diplomatic choreography designed to nudge the United States a few steps closer to a leadership role in global security without alarming the isolationists in Congress. But in diplomacy, timing is everything. A message delivered at the right moment can change the trajectory of history. The same message delivered late is just another piece of paper, and this one arrived after the door had already closed. When you trace the ripple effects forward, the consequences of that missed moment are staggering. Without early American involvement, the Anglo-French position against Hitler in the late 1930s remained fragmented. Appeasement, symbolized by Neville Chamberlain's trip to Munich in 1938, became the dominant strategy. The United States, meanwhile, doubled down on the Neutrality Acts, with Congress in 1937 even tightening restrictions on arms sales to warring nations. Roosevelt, who privately saw the danger in European appeasement, found himself boxed in politically. By the time he could act decisively through measures like Lend-Lease in 1941, the Axis powers had already gained enormous ground. Historians sometimes debate whether America's isolationist mood was so strong that even an early pact in 1936 wouldn't have changed much. But that argument overlooks the psychological impact of perceived alliances. If Hitler had believed in 1936 that the United States was willing to coordinate with Britain and France, he might have calibrated his risk-taking differently. Even small doubts in the mind of an aggressor can slow their advance, and in those fragile years, slowing him down might have been enough to change the sequence of events. This is where the eureka moment of our investigation comes in. The letter's delay was not just an administrative mishap, it was a microscopic hinge in history. Think of it like a railroad switch left unturned. At the moment Hull wrote it, the train of world events was still rolling slowly toward an uncertain junction. Delivered on time, the letter might have flipped that switch toward a path of early deterrence. But because it sat in Pittman's in-tray, unseen, the train kept going straight into the years of unchecked aggression that would ignite World War II. And here's the part that makes this so characteristically the domino effect. Robert Hinshaw, the junior clerk whose decision to bundle the letter with other papers led to the delay, had no idea of its significance. In fact, when interviewed in the 1950s for an oral history project, he recalled vaguely that there was some important correspondence in that load, but I didn't think it was urgent. To him, it was just another envelope among dozens he handled that week. In other words, a man barely a month into his job made a choice that, while invisible to him, helped shape the conditions for the deadliest conflict in human history. By the time the United States finally entered World War II in December 1941, millions had already died, and the map of Europe had been violently redrawn. Would early U.S. engagement in 1936 have prevented the war entirely? Probably not. But it might have contained it, kept it from spreading as far and as fast, and saved millions of lives. That is the haunting what-if embedded in the story of the letter in the drawer. And the lesson for us today is crystal clear. History is not just written by presidents, generals, or prime ministers. It is also written silently, invisibly, by clerks, aides, and junior staff who make everyday decisions about which piece of paper goes where. That's why these tiny, overlooked moments are so valuable to uncover. They remind us that systems, no matter how grand or powerful, are ultimately made of people. And people are fallible. If this dive into how a single delayed letter helped steer U.S. foreign policy down a different path has changed how you see the machinery of history, then you know exactly why we tell these stories. Hit like, share it with someone who still thinks history is just about battles and treaties, and subscribe to the Domino Effect, where we show you the hidden levers and overlooked accidents that move the world in ways you'd never imagine.